As you heard, it's really a privilege and a blessing to be here with you all. I am not a pastor. As you heard from the bio, I'm not a minister, so don't hold me to that standard. But I have grown up in the church, in the Seventh-day Adventist church, since I was born, and had the opportunity to learn and study and observe. And as you heard in the bio, I went through college and all these different experiences, and I think there's something about being in the world in a certain way or getting exposed to information that causes you to have to question the things that you were taught or the things that you believed in, and to question the culture, the traditions that you are brought up in. And so throughout my education, particularly in college, when I first got to college, went through a lot of transitions from being agnostic to being atheist and to being a believer again. And through that period of time and through those learnings, my dad and I would often have many conversations.
Yes.
And we would go back and forth, on doctrine, on philosophy. And some of those conversations we thought would be really good to bring before churches and to really start to think more deeply, not only about our spirituality, but particularly from the lens that I have as a psychiatrist, looking at the intersection between our spirituality and our mentality, our mental health. Those things are very interrelated. And sometimes I think in our culture, particularly within church, we tend to not necessarily want to address some of the things that are happening from the mental health standpoint. But there's some highlights that I want to just point out before I allow my dad to kind of give his side of what it was like as a father to see me go through these transitions, and then we'll get into the scripture. So in America right now, about 1 in 4 adults, 26% of Americans age 18 or older, have a diagnosable mental disorder. Many people actually suffer from more than one at a time, and we know that as things like depression and anxiety increase, co-occurring substance use can also happen. But this is not something that just happens out in the world. Lifeway Research did a big study on Christians, actually. 1 in every 4 pastors acknowledge that they have personally struggled with a mental illness.
Hear that? 1 in
4 pastors, not people in the congregation, the pastors. 32% of churchgoers said a close acquaintance or family member died by suicide. That's 1 of 3 people in the church knows someone closely who has died by suicide. But one of the things that really stood out to me, and one of the reasons why we're doing this, is that only 4% of churchgoers who lost a loved one to suicide, so these are people who actually lost someone to suicide, 4% of them said that the church leaders were aware of their loved one's struggles. That means 96% of people who had someone close in the church die of suicide, the church leadership was completely unaware of it. And so it's in that context that we're before you today to talk about this and to this afternoon create a space where we might even go deeper and be able to answer some questions.
Unfortunately, the narrative is that if you love Jesus and if you serve Jesus, you shouldn't have depression. You shouldn't have a mental illness. So people suffer in silence. And often it's embarrassing to acknowledge that you have a mental problem. For instance, it's easier to tell the church members, I got diagnosed with cancer, than to tell somebody, I'm dying of a broken heart. And so as a father, especially being a pastor, I remember the anguish I went through seeing Stephen make these detours, because I thought he would follow in my footsteps and be a preacher. And he chose not to. And I remember thinking, but where did I go wrong? Where could we have gone wrong? Because he was always a very obedient kid. He loved going to church, loved reading the Bible. So it hit me out of nowhere. And it was a struggle to see him navigate these roads and wonder, would he return? Would he find, I would tell him sometimes, son, don't go too far from shore, please. So if you want to come back, you can come back. So it's a joy for me to have him here at my side. But the point I'm making is this. When he shared with me some of his own anguishes, some of his own issues, in my mind I'm thinking, where did it happen? We were a good family. And so today we are hoping that as we talk about the question, too flawed to serve? In other words, are we too flawed to serve? Is being flawed as a human being a disqualification from serving God? I am hoping it will bring hope to someone to recognize that we are not alone.
Yeah, I mean, part of the even idea, right, when I first got up here, I said, I'm not a minister, don't hold me to that standard, is this idea that we have to be perfect in order to serve God. Yet we know that we are human. How do we hold this image of perfection that maybe we want to attain to the reality of the fact that we are flawed? And in fact, when we look in the Bible, we see that there are many examples of people who are righteous, who have a special connection to God, but go through some very challenging, traumatic, emotionally destabilizing events. One of the stories that we want to start with is Joseph, right? Yeah. And Joseph is one of these people. We'll get into a few others, but Joseph is one of these people who, in some ways, can do no wrong, right? He has all these really bad things happen to him, yet he still seems to always rise to the top. But there's some nuggets, I think, in here that we can get if we look deeper. So to start off, we'll start at Genesis 37. This is, as many of you know, Joseph, was the favored son. He had the special code. There was some tension in the family dynamics that we'll talk about. But in Genesis 37:19, it says, "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now," this is his brothers, "come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." So these are quite some family dynamics that we start off with in Joseph's story. I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit and how that might be useful for him.
You know, things have really gone wrong in this family when they want to kill him. It must be said that in the culture in which this happened, you had one man, Jacob, with 4 wives, and the children jostling for position. Unfortunately, because Jacob loved Rachel, he elevated Joseph, who was almost the youngest son, to a position of preeminence. Imagine, while the older brothers are out there with the flock, Joseph is home with Jacob. That tells you something. Then Jacob gives him this coat of many colors, which symbolized passing the mantle over to Jacob. So there was a lot of resentment in this family. And Joseph himself grew up being privileged. Sometimes when we read that Joseph told on his brothers, remember that? Joseph told on his brothers. He was tattling on them. He was daddy's little pet. And they hated him for that. So what we see is that Joseph developed a very individualistic mentality in a very collective society. And because of the favoritism of his father, it created anger, resentment, and a desire to kill him.
Right, so this is the family dynamic that Joseph is developing through. And, you all, I'm sure, know the story. They ended up deciding, well, let's not kill him. Maybe that's a little too extreme. But let's instead sell him to slavery. We'll still tell our father that he died, but at least in this way, we don't have his blood on his hands. Joseph ends up going to slavery in Egypt and going to work for Potiphar. And this is where we kind of jump back into the story in Genesis 39. So things are going well. Joseph, is really has made an impact on the household. And it says, now Joseph was well built and handsome. This is verse 6, going into 7. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Goes on to say in verse 11, one day he went into the house to attend his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me again." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." And jumping down to 19, when his master, Potiphar, heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me?" He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph goes from, again, having a very privileged, special existence to being sold into slavery, kind of working his way up, being diligent. Now he's lied on by Potiphar's wife, and he ends up having to go to prison. Very stressful. But tell us something about the nuance here in terms of what Potiphar does and decides with Joseph.
Potiphar did not believe his wife. Had he believed his wife, Joseph would have been? Yes. But he had to live up to his reputation. Because let's be honest, people could tell when somebody likes somebody, even in church. I think Deacon Tony looking at Sister Mary, we see it. So you can't tell me that all this time she's telling Joseph, come, and some servant didn't notice something. So they knew. And this is one of the things we see in Bible culture and even in church culture. Everybody knows, but nobody wants to say anything. Let me say it over. Everybody knows, but nobody wants to say anything. So the servants knew, even Potiphar knew, but to live up to the image, he's put to jail an innocent man.
Right, and so again, you know the story. Joseph ends up going into jail, and even in jail, it says God was with him. I think this is an important point because I think, in a naive way or in a beginning part of one's spiritual journey, you might think that, if I do the right things, then life is supposed to be good.
Yes.
Like, if I look out, God should look out for me, right? And I think a lot of times in the Bible, instead what we see is that it's not instead of, but in spite of the trials that God is with people. And in that sense, we see it happening here with Joseph. We won't go into all the details, but there are the baker and the butler who have dreams. Joseph ends up interpreting those dreams. One of them gets out, ends up going to Potiphar and saying, hey, once he's having his dreams, there's someone here who can interpret dreams. Joseph is able to rise out of this situation to become one of the main leaders in Egypt.
Right.
And at this time, his brothers now come back in that family dynamic. So let's unpack what happens there.
Yeah. Now, when I hear people preach about Joseph, from the pit to the prison, to the palace, that kind of stuff, we talk about how Joseph was able to transcend and rise above because God was with him. But it seems as though no one is willing to ask themselves, what was this doing to Joseph's mind? To be ripped from your family, to be lied upon, to have the butler say, I'm your guy. Once I get up there, I'm going to talk to Pharaoh. And then 2 years pass, or 3, and he said, what was happening in Joseph's mind? I think when his brothers came, we get a glimpse of the emotional trauma that was in Joseph's spirit.
Yeah, and you all, and I actually want you to go into a little bit what happens with the cup and with Benjamin and how that kind of shows some of the transformation that's happening in the brothers. And then let's deal with Joseph's own emotional reaction to observing that transformation.
Yes. When the brothers come, they don't recognize Joseph. He recognizes them. And I want to just drop this here. When people expect you to be at the bottom of the barrel, they don't recognize you when you get to the top of the barrel. So they don't recognize him, but he sees them immediately. I say, these are my brothers. So he begins to work his trial of his brothers by giving Benjamin more food than the others to see how they would react. Then putting his cup in Benjamin's sack and then saying, this is the man who stole my cup. He's going to have to stay here and go to prison. And of course, the brother said, please, you can't do this. We got to go back home. We have our families there. So he said, I'll keep one of you. Which one did they keep? Simeon. Simeon was the most wicked of the brothers, the most violent. So maybe that is why he kept Simeon in prison. So they go home. Then they had to come back for more food. And this story always touches my heart. After Joseph does all this stuff and eventually says, okay, you guys go back to your father, but leave the thief with me. Judah, he says, my Lord, please listen to me. This boy, my father's life is bound up in the life of this boy. If we go back and he isn't there, I can't see the pain on my father's face. Please, keep me instead. But let him go back to my father. This was a demonstration of such selflessness, of such change, of such maturity that Joseph couldn't hold it in anymore.
Yeah, we see throughout, these different trials, Joseph presents, and the way he's presented in the Bible is as very poised, very much like able to deal with these stressors and kind of keep going. But here in chapter 45, it says, then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And verse 2 says, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it.
Yes.
And I think this is really critical because I think it shows that even someone like Joseph, right, who we put on a pedestal, who went through all these things and really still stayed righteous, it had an impact on him. So much so that the Bible really points out that he wept so loudly, the Egyptians heard it, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. This was an event. And so even for someone who is really in tune and really sort of living a righteous path, these events, these traumas, these ways in which our interpersonal relationships affect us have a big impact on our emotion. I think that's something here that we see manifested in Joseph at that critical moment where he can no longer hold back the years of emotion and distress that he's had about this situation.
In fact, many Bible scholars believe that the things that Joseph did to his brothers was part of his cleansing. Do you know what it is to, do you know what it is to be treated badly by your own loved one, people who should have you? What that would have meant? You push forward and you go forward, but something is there. And so with all he did to his brothers, many people believe that was his way of sort of like giving them a taste of their own medicine. It was a way for him to work his way through the emotions. And that's why eventually when Judah spoke the way he did, it told him they had changed. And all this bottled up stoicism, all this, Jesus is my Lord, I'm praising. It came out. It reminded me of a time we went to Atlanta, a group of us. We belonged to a singing group from Trinidad. And one of our members was very sick, so we had a concert in Atlanta. So we all went down and we sang, and it was great. But then when it was time to come back, I got sick. Maybe something, whatever it was, I was feeling really sick. And everybody was like, hey, we got to go back to New York, get back to our... And I was like, Soppy, we don't know what to do. And nobody seemed to be listening. Like, Inskip is sick. He came with you guys. And I'm being stoic and saying, all right, well, guys, but inside I'm wondering, how could, if my best friend who was there at the time, just abandoning me. So I remember I went outside, and one of the members of the group, even someone who we weren't even much close, right? He and I wasn't really close all the years. He came and he said, Inskip, how you feeling, boy? And when he said that, everything just came out. I began to weep and to cry. Just knowing somebody cared, even somebody who wasn't my best friend, came to talk to me and showed caring, it bursted open. And so I could identify with Joseph at this moment.
Yeah. And so, I think the first point here is that our emotional responses to trauma and stress are real. And even as we live in righteousness, we can't neglect the impact that it's having on us. And there are ways we can deal with that we'll talk about. But again, I think Joseph is generally considered to be someone who is, the straight and narrow and does everything right. But there are other examples of people who are put in sort of more precarious situations and might make decisions that we might judge. And I think Tamar is a really good example of that. So set some context for who she is and even the relationship between this story with Joseph and Judah, his brother.
So Tamar was Judah's daughter-in-law. She was not an Israelite or Hebrew. So in other words, the Adventist boy marries the Catholic girl, if you want to put it that way. So she's an outsider. So she comes in. And Onan, her first husband, dies. The Bible says he was wicked, and God took him. He dies. So now, because of the law of levirate marriage, where if you die and have no children, your brother would marry your wife, and the first child would be counted as your brother's son. So when Earth's turn came, he said, I'm not having a child for my brother because now we're going to have to split the inheritance, whatever have you. So he decides not to impregnate Tamar. And it says that was wicked. And he died. So now there was one brother, younger brother, who should have now stepped in. But Judah is thinking, this is a woman, this is a man killer. I'm not going to let my next son go to this woman. She's killing men. And he decides to tell her, go back to your home until Sheila, that was his name, comes of age. Then he will marry you, and life goes on. But Judah doesn't do that. Judah is Joseph's brother. And so Judah doesn't do that. And he subjects Tamar to perpetual widowhood in her father's house. Now, the truth is, Judah could have done the work. As her father-in-law, he could have done the levirate marriage and impregnate Tamar and create sons and then step aside. He didn't do it. And now when Sheila's age came, he didn't do it. But he's living his life nice, and Tamar is there, her life stuck.
And so that brings us into Genesis 38, and we'll jump in at verse 13, where it says, when Tamar was told, your father-in-law, this is Judah, is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Sheila had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife, as was supposed to have happened. Now when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face, not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law. He went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you, she asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it, she asked. He said, what pledge should I give you? She says, your seal and its cord, and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. So here, I mean, this is a decision that I think would be very scandalous.
Yes.
Right? And so tell us a little bit more about, like, how Judah comes to find out about this, and how does God now judge Tamar in the context of this story?
Let me just say this. God hates injustice. Can I say that again? Especially when we take advantage of the poor and the weak. Most of the prophets, when they spoke against Israel, they spoke about the injustice, the abuse of the poor. Bear that in mind. So even though Tamar is an outsider, she's still a child of God, and God still cares about her. But Tamar finds herself in a male-oriented society in which Judah could get away with this, and she has no choice but to stay in her father's house, no life, because Judah is not doing what he has to do. So she comes up with a plan. Some of you would say to trap him, which is what she did. So now she's back home, and she gets pregnant. People begin to see it. And as typically happened with the rumor weed, you know, they ran to tell Judah, your daughter-in-law has played the harlot in her father's house. Now that was something worthy of death. And Judah, all self-righteous as we tend to be, he's ready to have her head. And when he gets there, he says, hold on, before you kill me, please identify this seal, this ring, and this staff. And in that moment, Judah recognizes, it's mine. And he says some words that are very telling. He says, you are more righteous than me, meaning you are in the right and I was in the wrong. He at least gave Judah this. He was able to acknowledge. Some of us can't do that.
And take accountability.
Yes. And then he said, you know what? You're okay. So Judah covers her. This is my child. By Judah now acknowledging this is his child that she's bearing, that reputation of prostitute goes away, because he as the father could have done that way before. So it just went on. And the good news is that her children would grow on to become the parents of Boaz, the forerunner of David. And so it shows that God really hates injustice, and he will even help those who have to find a way where there's no way.
Yeah, and I think there are a few things that really stand out to me here. One is, I think there's a cautionary tale here about being so quick to judge and condemn someone for the very same thing he was literally involved in, right? And I think sometimes, you know, in our journeys, we sometimes forget where we started or where we were. And so I think it's always important to really have that perspective that everyone's on a journey and not be so quick to judge. I think it also brings into this idea, which came up in the Sabbath school, but like, how does God judge people's intent versus action and context? And I think sometimes we can be very legalistic and very black and white. And a lot of times I see God operating within the grays, those hues that actually give context and give complexity and nuance to the reality of our life. And I think the third thing is related to this, which is like God can use the most messed up, complicated situations to achieve the greatest good. You started with this lineage, but I actually want to push the fact that actually through Tamar, that lineage goes all the way to actually Jesus. So Jesus actually comes through this context. And I think that actually is a very powerful demonstration of God's ability to work with the complexities of our lives to achieve something greater.
So Tamar had to go against convention to get justice. The scripture reading, the thing I want to do, I don't do, because even though I want to do what is right, I find this other law in me. Our humanity is messed up. And sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we are responding to trauma from our childhood. Narratives that were written in our head: you're no good, you're ugly, you're too fat, you're too thin, you're too whatever have you. And these things drive our behavior. And here, Tamar, whatever was said to her coming in from the outside, coming in, she held on to what was right. She didn't just abandon ship. She decided, I will get justice. Not in a way that good church folks would approve of, but the very fact that even Judah has to come back and say, no, you're in the right, shows that even though, had she not done that, she would have stayed a widow in her father's house. So had she not done what she did, she would not have gotten justice. And I keep asking myself this question: how many people in our homes, in our churches, in our society live in situations where they have no choice but to try to find a way out? Like that Adventist who sometimes have to work on Saturday, you know what I'm talking about? Because if not, they can't pay their rent. You understand what I'm saying? And they find, or that girl or that guy who say, you know what, I need to marry an American because I've been up here now for 15 years and I can't get a green card and I can't move forward. I think I'm going to get married. You know what I'm talking about, right? It's not the ideal, but then nothing is ideal in this world.
Yeah, and I think this passes us to the next kind of character in the Bible, who I think is probably one of the most complex, nuanced people in the Bible, and this is Samson. So before we go into Judges 16 and talk about what happens with him and Delilah, set some context for Samson, who's probably one of the most troubled heroes, of the Old Testament.
Samson leaves us with a very dubious legacy. Is he a hero? Is he saved? Is he not? The thing about Samson, Stephen, is that of all the messed up people in the world, he should not have been messed up. He was actually born for a purpose. He was born to a good couple, a decent couple, who were old, past bearing. So we know this was a miraculous birth. Gifted with strength. Even prenatal instructions were given to Manoah and his wife, how to treat Samson. If ever there was a young man who should have grown up to be a hero, it should have been Samson. This is very troubling that the guy with everything messes up so badly. It kind of reminds me of another guy, right, Jephthah, who was an illegitimate child who they kicked out, and he ended up with the gangs. And yet he comes and saves Israel and is a man of honor, Jephthah, a man of character. Notice he had nothing. And yet somehow he is able to take that nothing and become something. Now Samson, who has everything, good home, good pedigree, everything, messes up. He is the most problematic of all the people in the scripture.
And it seems like, again, putting on the hat of a mental health professional and a psychiatrist, he seems to have a personality that was very addictive and risk-seeking, throughout his story. And that brings us, I think, directly to his encounter with Delilah in Judges 16. And it says, this is verse 18, when Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, come back once more, he has told me everything. So rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. After putting him to sleep on her lap, she called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Then she called, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He awoke from his sleep and thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. I'll say that again. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding grain in the prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. And so, I think in this situation, we see Samson and Delilah. At a younger age, I used to think, why does he keep going back to Delilah? And then I got older, I had some experiences, and I began to understand. But it's interesting that she's made it very clear that she is not having the best intent for him. Yet he continues to indulge until finally it says, she's able to subdue him, and the Lord had left him. And this, I think, is another point that really stands out for me, and it relates to that instruction that you talked about in terms of sometimes we want to go away from the shore. We want to explore and venture and see what's out there. And in those processes, sometimes we might go to a place and God is protecting us, right? So we don't face the consequences, and we might go do this, but God is protecting us. And it's a very, I think, humbling idea that God could leave you and you not know.
Yeah.
And so the things that you took for granted, the things that you felt like you were covered, can be removed. And so this is what happens to Samson, and he becomes subdued. But then there's some redemption in the story that we know happens at the end. But again, it's a very complicated sort of redemption.
Murder-suicide.
Exactly. And it says in verse 28, then Samson prayed to the Lord, Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood. Bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. And so again, here it leaves me with a kind of unsettling feeling, because in this moment, he's reaching out to God for help and resistance. And even in that moment, there's still a little bit of selfishness, because it's about his eyes.
Yeah,
right?
he wants revenge. Some people are very vengeful, and even in doing God's work, he wants revenge for himself. It's about himself. And this is what makes it so troubling, that even in this last act of redemption, Samson is still inward looking. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But then God gave him the strength. So it really clouds the picture.
And again, I think there's a couple things here. One is the fact that he's committing suicide in this context, and God is giving him the strength to do that in order to get revenge. And it becomes very, I think, complex. But I think it also, again, highlights this fact that God is not afraid of ambiguity. God is not afraid of gray. God is not afraid to use people where they are, how they are, to achieve what needs to happen for his mission, and for them to also have maybe some of the autonomy to choose the path that they're going to choose. And I think for me, as a flawed person who wants to do right, who wants to be on a high spiritual path, it's comforting to know that God is willing to forgive. God is willing to work with us and our flaws where we are, and he's willing to work with that ambiguity to get us to a different space.
Sometimes even those flaws become channels through which God can work. Because if Samson hadn't been the kind of wine woman and some kind of guy, there are many times when he was able to bring deliverance to Israel by getting himself into trouble. Mm-hmm. And getting himself out of trouble. And God is still willing to use this broken vessel. The thing is, even though he was born in the right home, with the right instructions and all of this, we have a human being who is troubled. Could have been the training he got. Maybe his parents were so glad to have a son in their old age, they pampered him too much. It may have been that they put too much on him. Like, you're going to be a deliverer. God has brought you here for this. And part of him was like, I don't want this. Why are you putting this on me? And he just goes the complete opposite. Whatever it was that drove Samson, we recognize here is a troubled young man with anger issues, with vengeance in his heart, very passionate, wanting fun, going into prostitutes, risking a lot. Even when he got up that night and took the whole gate on his shoulder and walks up with it, taunting the Philistines even. He was a very flawed human being. And the picture we have is one of ambiguity. Is he, or is he not? Is he a child of God, a saint, what someone saved or not? And that's a question I think as we wrap up, we want to kind of delve with this question of ambiguity, this area where we're not sure.
Yeah, and I think that this is where that personal relationship that we have with God provides a context. And I think, again, it's always easier to judge from the outside as to what is happening and why it's happening. But I think along these different stories in the Bible and the experiences that people have, we see God being willing to work with them, not judge, but take where they are and work with that. And I think the hope really is that whatever context we find ourselves in, whatever trauma or stress or negative things that have happened to us, one, God is aware of it.
Amen.
God doesn't judge it. He's here to provide the support and the context for us to be able to work through it. But also, it's never too far for us to have redemption, right? And even in the last moment, right? We look at the thief on the cross. Even in the last moment, unless we opt out, grace and salvation is always there for us. It's always an option. I think when we talk more this afternoon about how we in the church deal with our mental health, I think a big thing that can help us if we are able to put down some of the judgments, first of all, ourselves, right? But then the judgments of others. And what would it look like if church was a space where we could come and lay down the complexities and the nuances and the challenging aspects of our human experience and find true support in our vulnerability? What kind of hope could that bring to people that this is a space? How can we as Christians be better reflective of the reality of God that I see in the Bible, which is a God that is working with people in the mess, in the nuance, and in the complexities, not judging them or making them feel bad because of what's happened?
So this afternoon, we will go into the mental health and spirituality, how they walk side by side, how someone could be spiritual and have emotional mental health issues. I think that could be very liberating, because the truth is, none of us is fully good or fully bad. We all live in ambiguity. Some of us is a great father, but a horrible husband. Some of us are great children, but we are not good spouses. Some of us, in a given moment, we do such great things. People say, wow, what a kind man. Some of us would give somebody the last dollar in our pocket, and yet would turn around and be vengeful against another person. So we all occupy this ambiguous space where sometimes we're good, as the text says, and we say, I want to serve God, other times we are not good. So how do we deal with that? Another thing that blows my mind is that of all the heroes in the Bible, so many heroes in the Bible, there are really only 3 of them in which there is no written sin against their name. That people that we know of, one is Joseph, no, like what we'll call sin. The other is Daniel, and we can even say John the Baptist, right? There's no like King David. I mean, everybody knows what he did. But when we read about these guys, they seem to have gotten it. But think about it. If of all these heroes, Elijah, Jeremiah, David, Solomon, Moses, you name them, Paul, Peter, we see such flawed humanity. It means that Daniel, Joseph, and John are the exception, not the rule. Let me say that over. They are the exception, not the rule. No wonder God loves people in the Bronx. No wonder he loves this church with all the flaws, with all the issues, with all the fights on church board and all the other things. No wonder he continues to care, because God is coming in a messed up world to do something, and he is not ignorant of it. Sometimes we think God doesn't know. But I believe when Paul says, whom he called, he justified, and whom he justified, he glorified. What that means to me is that when the gospel message came to me, I was born into the church, was baptized at 9, You know those early teenage years when you kind of float, something like what you did, Stephen, right? Not as bad. Anyway, but then at 17, I remember at 17, recommitting my life to God and saying, Lord, I'm going to follow you. But it hasn't been just a straight it's been up. Sometimes the valleys are very deep and the mountains, yet very high. You know, as I look at my own life, I recognize that there are times where I'm really vibing. I'm ready for heaven. The other time I thought I was ready to be translated, honestly. And then I had to wake up and realize, no, you're not ready yet. That's all of us. That's all of us. But when God called me and offered me salvation, even the ministry, He knew all I would have to go through. How many years it would take to finally get it right. Could I say that again? He knows how many years it will take for you and me to finally get it right. He is not caught by surprise. This is not like you marrying somebody and thinking she's the best thing ever. You ever heard people say that? You're the best thing that ever happened to me until 6 months later they come back, Pastor, I don't know this woman. I don't know this woman. It's like a different woman. No, it's the same woman. You just didn't know her then. Well, guess what? God knew you from the very beginning. That should be encouraging.
It is encouraging. And I think, as we close, it's really, I think the message is that wherever we are and whatever we're going through, that there is hope. And that the God that we serve is one who's ready to meet us right now where we are and take us to that place that we're trying to go. And so as I asked the family to come up to minister this song, There's Hope, we ask that you reflect on it. And please come ready this afternoon to discuss more with us.
And everything. One thing what we do, we are very open. We will never give you some church narrative thing. We will deal with whatever you ask it honestly. So that is why we do this, because for too long we've been fed cereal when we needed some solid yams and dasheen. And we end up with a very weak church. And we say, no, we want to tell people the truth because Jesus told the truth. So that somebody could leave here feeling at least free with hope that I could do this. I am not too flawed to serve and to find the help that you need. These people in the Bible, they all had problems. But the good news is they never let their problems define them. They were bigger than their problems. And that's why today we honor them. So as we sing this song, yes, there is hope. As long as Jesus is alive, yes, there is hope.
Drugs
guns are destroying all our schools. No more interest in the golden rule. They took prayer out of the class. Tell me how long must this last? Yes, there is hope. Oh, there is hope. There is hope. No, there is hope. As long as Jesus is alive. Yes, there is hope. Yes, there is hope. Yes, there is hope. No, there is hope. There is hope. No, there is hope. As long as Jesus is